Hi everyone, today we are going to learn how to solve quadratic equations by completing the square. So here's a quick recap on how to complete a square. So our goal is to create a perfect square trinomial. So if you have something like this, x squared plus 2x, we're going to start the process by dividing our b value by 2. So if you guys remember, a is the coefficient of x squared, b is the coefficient of x. So I take my b value, which is 2, and I'm going to divide it by 2, and I get 1. Step 2 is to then square that answer. So then I square it, and 1 squared is 1. So this is the number, I call it the magic number. This number completes our square. So I'm going to take that number and I'm going to add it to our expression. So again, you take your b value, divide it by 2, and then you square that answer. That's the number you're going to add to your binomial. Now from here, all you have to do is factor your trinomial. We can do this with magic x. So remember, what two numbers multiply to make 1 and add to make 2? It must be 1 and 1. And if you did this correctly, these two numbers should be the same because we want to have the same factor squared. That's why we call it completing the square. So again, instead of writing this as x plus 1 times x plus 1, we'll write it as x plus 1 squared. And this is the completing the square process. So we can actually use this process to help us solve an equation. Okay, let's give this first example a try. So here we have x squared plus 6x plus 8 equals 0. So we would like to work with our x squared and x terms, and we want to complete this square. So the thing is that this plus 8 isn't the magic number we need. So we're going to start by moving this constant to the other side. We just want to get rid of it. So I can move it by doing the opposite. Since it's a plus 8, I'm going to subtract 8 from both sides, and I'm left with x squared plus 6x, and I'll leave a space, equals negative 8. So now I'm going to go through the completing the square process to help me find the number that is magical for this combination. So again, we take our b value, which in this case is 6. So we do 6 and we divide it by 2, and that gives us 3. And then we take that answer and we square it. So 3 times 3 is 9. So this is the number that I'm going to add, but since it's an equation, I need to add it to both sides of our equation. So this was our process to find that magic number. So again, b value divided by 2, and then you square that number. But 9, I'm going to add it to both sides, just so my equation maintains equality. So now I'm going to factor this trinomial. So what multiplies to make 9 and adds to make 6? 3 and 3. So that gives us x plus 3 squared, since it's the same factor twice. Now on the right side, I have 9 minus 8, which is 1. So now this next part is kind of new. Step 3 says to take the plus or minus square root of both sides of our equation. So again, we're trying to solve for x, so I have to make sure I can free it from my square. So I can do that by taking the plus or minus square root of both sides. So this square root will cancel out my square, and what I have left is x plus 3. So if you remember, a square root and a square are inverse operations, so they undo each other. And then what I have here is the plus or minus square root of 1. Well, the square root of 1 is just 1, so we have plus or minus 1. Now from here, we have to finish solving for x. We want our equation to say x equals. And I know that I can do that using my inverse operation. So I'm going to subtract 3 from each side. Now here, since I have this negative 3 plus or minus 1, we're actually going to create two separate equations, one for the plus, one for the minus. So here we're going to have x equals negative 3 plus 1 and x equals negative 3 minus 1. So we get x equals negative 2. That's one of my solutions. And x equals negative 4. That is my other solution. Now I know this seems like a lot of work, but if you remember, all the way up until here is just our completing the square process. Then to undo a square, we take the plus or minus square root of both sides, and then it's just solving for x. So this is just solving basic equations. So if you break it up into smaller parts, it's very doable. Okay, so now I'm going to ask you to pause the video and see if you can replicate that same process. So look at the example we just did and try to replicate those same steps with different numbers. Okay, go ahead and check your answers in the process. So remember, first we start by moving our constant. 3 is not the right number for us, so we're going to move it to the other side. Then we do the completing the square process to find our magic number, which is 4. And I'm going to add that number to both sides of my equation. So we get x squared plus 4x plus 4 equals 1. This trinomial can be factored into x plus 2 squared, since it's the same factor twice. Now the way you undo a square is by taking the plus or minus square root of both sides, leaving us with x plus 2 equals plus or minus 1. From here, I'm going to subtract 2 from both sides, leaving me with x equals negative 2 plus or minus 1. So then I need to do two equations, one for plus 1, one for minus 1, and that's how I get my two answers. Okay, we're going to try one more together. So again, our first step is always going to be to move our constant. We need to just get it to the other side because it's not the right number for our x terms. So again, I can do the opposite here. Since this is addition, I can move it by subtracting from both sides. Now I'm going to go through the completing the square process. So remember, you take your b value. Now in this case, our b value is negative 12, and we divide it by 2, and we get negative 6. And then we're going to square that answer. Negative 6 times negative 6 is positive 36. So I'm going to add 36 to both sides of the equation. From here, I see that I can factor this trinomial. So what multiplies to make 36 and adds to make negative 12? Negative 6 and negative 6. Remember, it should be the same number if you completed the squares correctly. So since it's the same factor, I can write it as x minus 6 squared, and 36 minus 23 is 13. Now remember, to undo a square, we're going to take the plus or minus square root of both sides, and that leaves me with x minus 6 equals the plus or minus square root of 13. Now, you can't simplify the square root of 13, so it actually stays like that in our answer, but we do need to take one more step to finish solving for x. So we get positive 6 plus or minus square root of 13. Now, in this case, I can't add 6 and square root of 13. This is a radical, this is not. So this is actually an acceptable way to leave our answer. Or you can write it as two separate answers, as 6 plus root 13 and 6 minus root 13. So either way is correct. And remember, you can only leave it like this when you can't simplify your radical to a whole number. Okay, go ahead and pause the video and give this last one a try. See if you can look at the steps from example 2 and replicate with slightly different numbers. Okay, go ahead and check your work here. Remember, our first step is to move the constant to the other side by doing the inverse operation. Then we complete the square. So negative 10 divided by 2 is negative 5. Negative 5 squared is positive 25. So I add that to both sides, leaving me with this equation. This trinomial can be factored. It becomes x minus 5 squared. Remember, you should end up with the same two numbers here if you are completing the square correctly. The way you undo a square is by taking the plus or minus square root of both sides. Square root of 7 cannot be simplified, so we leave it as the plus or minus square root of 7. However, you do need to take this last step of adding 5 to each side. So you can either write your answer like this, 5 plus or minus root 7, or you can write them as two separate answers, one for the plus, one for the minus. Okay, that is all for today's video. Thank you so much for watching.